Hello, I'm Bill Kissane. I'm Associate Professor of Politics in the Government Department at the LSE. The main question in any book on civil war is trying to explain the destructiveness of civil war, that we have literature going back 2,000 years kind of identifying this form of conflict as a form of conflict that is associated with chaos, great violence, brutality. So the question is there something constant in history about the capacity of societies to kind of destroy themselves through civil war? Or is it the case that in the last maybe 60 or 70 years these factors are actually making conflicts of more destructiveness? So it really is this question of kind of the connection between self-destruction and civil war as a form of conflict that's the kind of unifying thread throughout the book. I started from the assumption that kind of everyone who reads history or politics knows one particular civil war, like the American Civil War, very well. So I wanted to write a book that summarizes the recent social science literature on civil war for people who are more familiar with historical material and kind of big cases. But at the same time, I wanted to critique the social science literature on civil war from a historical perspective. The assumption being that social science is very good at identifying general causes and consequences, but if we want to understand how a society actually experiences a civil war, we need to go on beyond the boundaries of social science and take in history, art, literature and so forth. So the book is very interdisciplinary in that sense, that it's intended to be a kind of dialogue between different disciplines, with the core being social science or political science, but those other disciplines also having equal validity in terms of doing what I was attempting to do. Well, if you start with the assumption that people's understanding or apprehension of what's going on in the world is mediated through what they get in the media manages to make conflicts that are happening in very different places very close, and at the same time it gives the impression that there's a connection between these conflicts. It's almost as if they're all part of a kind of violence that is kind of unstoppable. And you have to add some nuance to this, because actually in terms of different points in the 20th century, we're not at the most violent point in the 20th century. When we look at different contexts like Latin America, parts of Asia, certainly Europe, you could actually say that violent conflict is on the wane, not on the increase. And I suppose in terms of how much civil war we're going to see in the future and how destructive they're going to be, you can say with respect to Syria, well, 500,000 people have been killed, 50% of the population have been displaced. There may never be the same Syrian state in the future. You can say that that capacity for self-destruction is still there. But there's one critical thing, which is any major civil war becomes a major civil war largely because it gets sucked into international conflict. So in terms of this question of how much civil war we're going to see in the future, it's actually a question of international relations and international order, rather than a question of domestic politics or domestic grievances. So really the onus is on people who basically run the larger states in the world and international institutions to get their act together, because what we've seen in Syria is that when a conflict began based on domestic grievances, but it was in a geopolitical context that was very, very volatile, you have at least 6 or 7 states that are pursuing their own agenda via the Syrian civil war. So it's become a kind of proxy war, and that's what's made it so destructive. So what I would say in terms of this impression that the world is so violent and all these conflicts are interrelated, that this is actually the critical factor when it comes to civil war. It's the linkage between domestic conflict and international conflict, and I think it's always been like that.